Your loved one gets incarcerated for a year, but is murdered. He dies on the day he's supposed to come home. And then they tell you no one will be punished. You get no justice. As I dig, I find out not only is this common in Alabama, but the deceased inmates are also missing their organs. Join me as I try to figure out what's going on in Alabama. Please note that the content of this recording may contain graphic material, including torture, and explicit language may be used. The opinions are of my own and may be offensive to some listeners. They are my opinions. Everyone has them, and if you do not agree, then ignore them like an adult and move on. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Hey Ravens, welcome to the Ravens Knock. I'm your host, Amy. I want to thank you guys for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and also referring your friends. If you're not a premium member, you can do so for $7 a month, which is like a cup of coffee. It does help the show out, as podcasting is not free. And you get ad-free content, bonus episodes that no one else gets. And with that said, let's go ahead and get started. 22-year-old Daniel Terry Williams, a father of two small children, was incarcerated for 12 months for property theft when he was sent to the Stanton Correctional Facility in Elmore County, which is part of the Alabama Department of Corrections, to finish the remainder of his sentence. They put him in open population, and he was housed with an inmate who was 38 years of age and is known to the public as Inmate X. Inmate X has been involved in at least 9 sexual assaults, rapes, and stabbings just since 2017, while being incarcerated in ADOC, and yet he remains being housed in general population and has never been disciplined or segregated for these, and somehow he remains to have a perfect record for the last 6 years that the warden has signed off of. 9 days and a few days before Terry was to be released, Terry was found unresponsive in a cell of X and was taken to the hospital. He later died on the day he was supposed to be released. He had been drugged, raped, tortured, and beaten for days. The prison called his stepsister and told her that he had been taken to the hospital for a drug overdose. When they got to the hospital, they were shocked at what they saw. This was not just a drug overdose. His father said he had bruises all up and down his body, cuts. He had indentation in his head. It looked like they took a mop handle or something and beat him across the head with it. He was in bad shape. He said he also received conflicting timelines from inmates and the warden about what had happened to his son. He explained the doctor told him, while not officially brain dead, that Daniel had lost 90% of his brain and he was not going to recover. He said his son was a hard worker and was trying to do the right thing by completing his sentence. He was an easygoing, loving kid. He's got 2 kids that he was taking care of before he got locked back up and everything. He was trying to do the right thing. He said he just wants justice for his son and hopes no one else has to go through such an ordeal. I just want everybody to know what's going on in there and to stop all this violence in these prisons. We're sending them in there to get help and to serve their time, not to come out in a casket. Just to let you know, no one's getting punished for this. Not the inmate X, not the guards, not the warden, not the prison, nobody. I read that and my blood started to boil. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And so I started digging. And you know what? He's not the only one. And then I found some other things that blew my mind. And I was kind of shocked. And I thought, everybody needs to know this. Apparently, Daniel was tied up, held hostage in a corner of a dormitory for at least 2 days forced to consume drugs, beaten, and raped until he was unconscious. X had been accused of raping another inmate several times, also calling out a hit. Both of those instances happened in 2022. He was also accused of selling drugs and threatening an inmate last August. He did not get into any kind of trouble for those offenses. They wrote them off as enemies being enemies. In 2021, X was accused of making threats to an inmate because of a debt, sexual assault that resulted in a man being hospitalized, stabbing a man who refused to be in a relationship with him in 2019, chasing and harassing a man in 2019 for trying to get him to have sex with him, sexual assault in 2019, sexual assault in April 2018, and in June 2017, a guard witnessed him slap another inmate twice and start a fight. He was making sexual advances to the man. February 2017, stabbing and sexual assault. In 2015, guards found a man who had been in the floor unresponsive, covered in blood, stabbed in the head, neck, chest, back, arms. The weapon was found outside of X's cell in a trash can, and X had on bloody clothes. The last disciplinary action was in 2018 when he got in trouble for possessing a weapon. Now, Alabama has got several lawsuits against them from family members. And they also have a lawsuit from the Department of Justice that I'll get into in a minute. In 2017, a 35-year-old prisoner at the prison was taken to the hospital for a drug overdose, but he never woke up. When they done the autopsy, he was found to have had a fractured skull, and his cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. Officers had ended up hog-tying him, putting him face down on a gurney, and left him vomiting and bleeding for over an hour. Joseph Headley was the warden at the time, and he never reported his officers. He was transferred out of that prison only to be the head warden at another. Unfreaking believable. In 2022, another inmate died of blunt force trauma in another Alabama prison. The day before he died, he had written a letter to the warden stating that a guard had beaten him over the head while he was handcuffed and sprayed him in the mouth with mace. That guard was only charged with assault. They claimed the death was accidental. On October 4th, 2023, the ADOC wrote an inmate-on-inmate assault was repeated at Ventress Correctional Facility. Inmate Lewis Christopher Latham was injured in an assault outside the kitchen area. He was transported to an area hospital where he underwent surgery for his injuries. On October 10th, 2023, the inmate succumbed to his wounds and was pronounced deceased by attending medical staff at the hospital. ADOC Law Enforcement Services Division is investigating his assault and subsequent death. Latham was 40 years old, serving a 21-year sentence for robbery 1 out of Lee County. Adam Bond, who was serving a 20-year sentence for first-degree robbery and burglary, was severely beaten in November by a fellow inmate while he was incarcerated at the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in Bessemer. His mother said that she was not notified of her son's condition until after learning he had undergone brain surgery for his injuries, and he passed away. His attorney wrote, "I am writing to alert you to the fact that Clifton Adam Bond has reason to believe that he is in danger because of certain officers. Other inmates have told him that these employees were discussing wanting to get him off camera so they could retaliate against him for trying to get medical attention for another inmate. Adam is not someone who admits to being fearful, even when he was attacked last month, but I do believe he has genuine fear of an imminent attack." That family's filing a lawsuit, and in that lawsuit are claims about his organs being removed and missing. Yeah, what? Yeah, his organs are missing, and he isn't the only inmate who has had their organs missing. Do you smell a rat, or is it just me? What y'all doing in Alabama? Just in 2023 alone, Alabama prisons has had 325 deaths. Compare that with Tennessee, we've had 199. Alabama's mortality rate is 5 times the national average, with 1,370 per 100,000 people. In 2019, an officer beat a man to death. Alabama denies this, but the family won a lawsuit, so you decide. To top it off, the officer never got disciplined. They said the force was justified. In 2023, 246,815 grams of controlled substances was recovered. From June to August, like June, July, August, close to 2,000 weapons were recovered, 3 firearms, 1,351 knives, and 600 other weapons. One family member says, "I have lost my business and my home. I've gone through my grandmother's and my dad's retirement just to pay the extortion." Yeah, inmates are extorting family members. And family members are paying it to keep their loved ones alive. They don't feel their loved ones are protected from sexual violence and physical violence, and many of these families are extorted for thousands of dollars to try to keep their loved ones safe. They feel that there is nowhere to turn. She said her son is almost unrecognizable. He's been stabbed over 60 times. His nose is broken. His teeth are knocked out. His fingers are severed. His ear is severed. There's been a lot of incidents. So the Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit against the Alabama Department of Corrections, and so y'all are going to have to bear with me. I'm just a country girl. I've only had a little bit of college, so I'm going to wing it. Some of this may be a little bit boring, but kind of stick with it because there is cases in here that goes into detail of what's going on in the prison. So here we go. There is reasonable cause to believe that the correctional officers within the Alabama Department of Corrections, ADOC, frequently use excessive force on prisoners housed throughout Alabama's prisons for men. Such violations are pursuant to a pattern or practice of resistance to the full enjoyment of rights secured by the 8th Amendment. We identified frequent uses of excessive force in 12 of the 13 Alabama prisons that we reviewed. Given the identified pervasiveness of excessive force and the statewide application of ADOC's use of force policies and procedures, we have reasonable cause to believe that the uses of excessive force occurring within Alabama's prisons give rise to systemic unconstitutional conditions. The severe overcrowding and understaffing present in Alabama's prisons contribute to the patterns or practices of uses of excessive force. As of January 2020, Alabama's 13 prisons held 6,000 prisoners over their designated capacity. The severe and pervasive overcrowding increases tensions and escalates episodes of violence between prisoners, which lead to uses of force. At the same time, the understaffing tends to generate a need for more frequent uses of force than would otherwise occur if officers operated at full strength. In an adequately staffed prison, officers can show a use of force and command presence to discourage fighting among prisoners or to quickly end fighting through sheer force of their numbers. But because Alabama's prisons are severely overcrowded and operate substantially below the necessary staffing level, officers often find themselves near instances of prisoner violence. As might be expected, the increase in use of force incidents tend to produce a rise in the number of incidents of excessive force, regardless of the initial reasons for that force. In some circumstances, officers may perceive the need to extricate themselves quickly from the potential dangers posed by dozens of unrestrained prisoners given the housing circumstances in most facilities, and may use more force than is reasonably necessary to subdue resisting or fighting prisoners. And relatedly, officers sometimes use force to punish prisoners involved in altercations. In addition, inadequate supervision and failure to hold officers accountable for their behavior contribute to an increase in the incident of excessive force. Insufficient staffing extend to supervisor ranks as well. Without correctional supervisors who demand adherence to use of force policy, training, and law, and who identify, discipline, and remove offending officers, correctional officers are far more likely to act with impunity than if staffing levels are appropriate. Combined with the lack of accountability, particularly the failure to discipline officers who engage in excessive force, this understaffing exacerbate the pattern of excessive force in Alabama's prison. In sum, overcrowding and understaffing at every level contribute to uses of force that might otherwise be avoidable, and to a significant number of uses of force that go beyond constitutional limits. These uses of excessive force, which include the use of batons, chemical spray, and physical altercations such as kicking, often result in serious injuries and sometimes death. Indeed, in the last months of 2019, at least 2 prisoners at 2 different ADOC facilities died following the uses of force. In October 2019, correctional officers at Donaldson used force against a prisoner, resulting in his death. As part of the autopsy, an ADOC investigator informed a coroner that after an officer opened his cell, the prisoner rushed toward another officer carrying 2 prison-made weapons. The correctional officer ordered the prisoner to drop the weapons, but the prisoner failed to comply. As a result, the officer sprayed the prisoner with a chemical agent, but it had no effect. The officer then struck the prisoner on the arm, causing the prisoner to drop one weapon. A second correctional officer responded to the scene and administered a palm heel strike to the prisoner's head, as well as knee-to-head strike as he tried to disarm the prisoner. The prisoner eventually went to the ground face down, and officers reported that the prisoner concealed a knife between his upper torso and the floor. Numerous prisoners and witnesses reported that correctional officers continued to strike the prisoner after he dropped all of his weapons and posed no threat. The prisoner was airlifted to the hospital due to the extent of his injuries. Photographs revealed extensive and severe bruising and swelling along the prisoner's face, left ear, eyes, and nose. The level of force used caused this prisoner to sustain multiple fractures to his skull, including near his nose, both eye sockets, left ear, left cheekbone, and the base of his skull, many of which caused extensive bleeding in multiple parts of his brain. The autopsy listed 16 separate and distinct injuries to the prisoner's head and neck, in addition to multiple fractured ribs and bleeding around a kidney. 2 months later, in December 2019, a prisoner at Ventress died after the use of force by staff. The autopsy revealed that the prisoner died from blunt force trauma to the head. He sustained multiple areas of intracranial bleeding, fractures of his nose and left eye socket, and had at least 6 teeth knocked out. ADOC personnel informed the hospital medical personnel that the injuries occurred after the prisoner fell from a bunk bed. 2 correctional officers were placed on mandatory leave while ADOC investigated the circumstances around the death. Subsequently, and that ADOC described as an effort to deter unacceptable behavior by staff, ADOC Commissioner announced that the establishment of an internal task force to examine, among other things, uses of excessive force by staff. In addition, ADOC announced that it would begin training to reinforce how force is to be used, starting in mid-December 2019 at Donaldson and Ventress. Based on what we learned from our investigation, including statements made by members of ADOC executive leadership team, we have cause to believe that many other uses of excessive force are unreported or underreported. The following are just a few examples of uses of force that are unconstitutional that we identified in Alabama's prisons. In September 2019, a lieutenant at Ventress lifted a handcuffed prisoner up off the ground and slammed him on the concrete floor several times, knocking him unconscious. The prisoner was unable to breathe on his own, was intubated and taken to an outside hospital where medical personnel administered CPR several times to keep the prisoner alive. In February 2019, a correctional officer at Elmore saw two prisoners jump a fence to retrieve contraband, stopped them, and took them to an office where three other correctional officers were working. A lieutenant in the office handcuffed the two prisoners and took them to an observation room across the hall from the office. A sergeant left the office to watch the surveillance video of the fence jumping and became enraged when he saw it. The sergeant returned to the office, got a key to the observation room, and went into the room where the handcuffed prisoners were sitting quietly. The sergeant pulled one of the handcuffed prisoners off the bed and into the hallway between the observation room and the office. The sergeant shoved the prisoner against the wall and knocked him to the floor. The sergeant punched and kicked the prisoner and then struck the prisoner with a collapsible baton approximately 19 times on his head, legs, arms, back, and body. During the assault, the prisoner defecated on himself. Throughout the beating, the prisoner did not resist and posed no threat. The sergeant then pulled the second handcuffed prisoner into the hallway and shoved him against the wall, striking him with the baton 3 times in the head, legs, and back. When the prisoner slid to the floor, the sergeant continued striking him, landing blows to his arms, legs, and abdomen. He also kicked the prisoner as he lay on the floor. 4 other ADOC employees, a lieutenant, 2 correctional officers, and another sergeant watched or were in the immediate vicinity of the beatings but failed to intervene either verbally or physically. The sergeant who assaulted the prisoners later filed a false report about the incident. The sergeant and 2 correctional officers pleaded guilty in federal court under 18 U.S.C. 242 of 2 counts of willful deprivation of constitutional rights under the color of law. The lieutenant was indicted for failing to intervene. In December 2018, a correctional officer brutally hit, kicked, and struck a handcuffed prisoner with an expandable baton in the Ventress medical unit. 2 nurses saw the officer beat the prisoner, and 2 other nurses could hear the beating from adjacent rooms. The prisoner did not antagonize the officer before beating, and his hands were handcuffed behind his back. During the beating, all 4 of the nurses heard the officer yell something to the effect of, "I'm the Reaper of Death, now say my name," and the prisoner begged the officer to kill him. At one point, a nurse observed the officer place his palms against the wall and his right foot on the side of the prisoner's face to grind the prisoner's head into the floor. The nurse intervened and the officer briefly removed his foot from the prisoner's head. When the officer tried to step on the prisoner's head again, the nurse sternly told the officer to calm down. The officer then paced the floor with the prisoner's blood on his clothing. Before leaving the medical unit, told the healthcare workers that they did not see anything. The officer filed a false incident report stating that he did not hit the prisoner. The body chart and photographs, however, documented clear swelling and abrasions to the prisoner's back and left arm, a bloody nose, and a gouge to his left shin. After an investigation, I concluded that the use of force was excessive and unjustified. I questioned whether the employee was fit for duty after the officer claimed that he suffered from undiagnosed PTSD. Despite I conclusions, we saw no indication in the documents ADOC provided us that I referred the matter for criminal prosecution or that ADOC imposed discipline. In July 2018, while being transported to healthcare unit at Staten, a prisoner taunted a correctional sergeant by sticking out his tongue. The sergeant punched the handcuffed prisoner in the face with a closed fist. I concluded that the sergeant used unnecessary and excessive force and failed to file an incident report. Less than a year later, the sergeant was arrested at the prison for attempting to smuggle contraband drugs into the facility. In April 2018, 2 prisoners received care at the Ventress Healthcare Unit after being involved in an altercation. As a correctional sergeant was taking one of the prisoners to restrictive housing, the prisoner ran away and knocked on the door of the administration building. The sergeant and the administrative employee caught the prisoner and handcuffed him behind his back. When they reached the restrictive housing dorm, the sergeant and the administrative employee both struck the prisoner in the jaw while he was still handcuffed. The prisoner began bleeding profusely from the mouth and was escorted back to the healthcare unit where the same nurse treated him. The nurse noted that the prisoner had more significant injuries than earlier and noticed a bone fragment protruding from the prisoner's gum. ADOC subsequently terminated the sergeant for the use of excessive force, among other things. In September 2017, an officer at Ventress sprayed a prisoner with a chemical agent as he masturbated in front of an officer and refused to stop. Regardless of whether this initial use of force was reasonable, what followed was excessive. Officers took the prisoner to the medical unit in handcuffs. Before they entered the medical unit, the prisoner began thrashing and gyrating his hips, so the correctional officer dumped a cooler of water and ice on the prisoner. The nurse advised the sergeant that dumping the water and ice on the prisoner constituted a fall hazard and could also cause the prisoner to go into shock if he had had a fever. The prisoner was then taken to the medical unit where he continued to thrash and gyrate his hips. The nurse believed the prisoner was unable to control his actions because he was under the influence of an illicit substance. The prisoner then fell from the examination table to the floor as the nurse tried to obtain his vital signs. The first sergeant threatened to kill the prisoner if he did not control his movements. While thrashing, the prisoner struck the sergeant's boot. In response, the sergeant kicked the prisoner several times in the stomach and chest. Another sergeant then took a shoe and hit the prisoners multiple times in the genitals. INI investigated and concluded that the first sergeant had used excessive force. The second sergeant, who observed much of the interaction, falsely denied striking the prisoner. INI found excessive force occurred. INI also closed the matter after both sergeants were arrested for other offenses, including smuggling contraband, and were no longer employed by the ADOC. In August 2017, a prisoner at Limestone threw a cup of what was likely urine at an officer through the tray door of a cell. The officer sprayed a chemical agent into the cell through the tray door and closed it. A captain and a lieutenant responded to the scene, and the captain was eventually able to handcuff the prisoner without resistance. As the captain and another officer were taking the prisoner for a medical assessment and decontamination of the chemical agent, a prisoner pulled away and moved toward the original officer. The original officer pushed the handcuffed prisoner and struck him several times. The lieutenant then restrained the officer. The captain investigated and recommended that the correctional officer receive corrective action due to the inappropriate application of force. We saw no indication that INI investigated the matter. Based on the documentation provided by ADOC, it is reasonable to conclude that excessive force occurred when the correctional officer struck the handcuffed prisoner several times. In March 2017, an officer at Donaldson sprayed cell buster spray into a closed cell. Several officers then opened the cell door and ordered the prisoner to exit. The prisoner claimed that he could not see and crawled out of the cell. One officer alleged that when they entered the cell and attempted to handcuff the prisoner grabbed the officer's legs. The officer then struck the prisoner with a baton several times. Photographs taken after the incident show at least a dozen welts or open wounds from the baton strikes to the prisoner's back. The prisoner also had a laceration over his eye and a swollen hand. Okay, guys, there's going to be a part 2 to this because this is an extra long one and I didn't want to have a 2-hour episode. So stay tuned. I'm going to try to post this tomorrow so you don't have to wait like a whole entire week to hear this. So please stay tuned. And until then, please like and subscribe and share to your friends. We're on all platforms if you can. Subscribe to the premium and help out the show. Podcasting is not free. This has been a Southern Sass production. And until next time, avoid rest stops and be safe.